Hello, and welcome to this Brookings Doha Center webinar on COVID-19 and migrant workers in the Gulf. My name is Noha Aboueldahab, and it's my pleasure to moderate this discussion today. Before we begin, please make sure to click on mute original audio and to select English for English. And if you would like to listen to this webinar in Arabic, please select French. I'll get to our wonderful speakers in a minute. This pandemic has made painfully clear that not 8 billion of us are in the same boat. Sure, COVID-19 does not discriminate in the sense that it has impacted both rich and poor and everyone in between. But the underlying difficult living and working conditions of so many have made it increasingly clear that certain groups suffer disproportionately over others. And of course, one of those groups is migrant workers in the Gulf region and in other parts of the world. After what seemed like a successful containment of the virus in Singapore, the country has since seen a resurgence in the spread of the coronavirus. And it has emerged that this is because of inadequate measures taken to address this problem of migrant workers living in close quarters despite the pandemic. Singapore, of course, is a country where there are approximately 1 million migrant workers, which is a similar proportion of migrant workers across the Gulf countries. And we have seen, reports about the particularly heavy concentration of the coronavirus in these spaces within which migrant workers live and work. So, of course, it's not surprising that a lot of attention is devoted to this issue of migrant workers and COVID-19. So what can we learn from the ways in which labor policies and public health policies are inextricably linked in the Gulf region? How will and how should this pandemic change the way we address labor issues in the Gulf region? And given the thirst for information about how this virus is unfolding and how it's impacting various sections of society, how do journalists report on these issues under the current circumstances where mobility and access are severely restricted? So to shed some light on these issues, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Zahra Babar is Associate Director for Research at the Center for International and Regional Studies at Georgetown University in Qatar. Zahra's areas of expertise include migration, labor policies, and citizenship issues in the Gulf. And she recently undertook field work on migrants coming to the GCC from Nepal and Pakistan. So a very warm welcome to you, Zahra. Houtan Homayounpour is the head of the International Labour Organization's Project Office in Qatar, where he oversees a multi-year program on labour rights. And he also acts as the focal point for the International Labour Organization's Regional Office for for Arab States. Welcome to you, Houtan. And last but not least, we have Borzou Daragahi, who is international correspondent at The Independent, where he covers the Middle East, Europe, and North Africa. Borzou is also a senior non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. So a very warm welcome to all of you. To our audience, please do send in your questions through the chat or Q&A function. Each speaker will give some opening remarks for around 5 to 7 minutes. I will then follow up with some questions, and then we can kick off the discussion where I'll be taking your questions. Zahra, let me start with you. As someone who's been working on migration and labor issues in the Gulf region for many years, what would you say are the most important, perhaps overlooked issues impacting migrant workers in the Gulf region within this context of COVID-19? And what should policymakers pay attention to now so that migrant workers in the Gulf are better off in the longer term? The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Noha. And thank you to you and your colleagues at Brookings for hosting me here at this webinar and so that I can have an opportunity to be part of the conversation. that is a really big question. And I'm actually going to focus my remarks just to one specific component of it, because as we know, there are multiple challenges that migrant workers experience across the region. And the challenges that they experience as a result of particular vulnerabilities are then amplified in the current circumstances. But what I want to speak about briefly is actually thinking about this sort of public health moment. And where my interest lies in this is based on fieldwork experiences, which actually weren't related at all to migrant workers' health or migrants' health. But during the course of fieldwork, some ideas became agitated. So from a public health perspective, human mobility has long been conceived of in conjunction with the spreading of disease. And globally, countries have adopted public health policy measures to ensure that people they receive on their territory are scrutinized for potential, health risks or threats that they bring into a host community. Migrants come in many different categories. So the sort of screening measures that are applied and how they are applied and where these medical screenings take place varies widely. I mean, so obviously for like asylum seekers and refugees, before they enter a final state that receives them, they are tested, but it's seldom in a country of origin. They would be having health screenings carried out, for example, in one or more transit states, and then of course, eventually in the state that receives them. But temporary labor migrants, and there are millions of them all over the world as people keep moving for seeking opportunities and jobs, they are probably the category of migrant that is put through the most intensive and regular forms of medical screening. And all migrants, all temporary labor migrants, the category of people we are talking about and who come into the GCC states have to go through at very early stages of the migration process. They have to go through really rigorous forms of health screening. Included in that health screening is a layer of testing that focuses on specific infectious diseases. Based on my knowledge and my conversations, these are primarily tuberculosis, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, HIV. And so what I find quite interesting is how taking part in these medical tests prior to the departure to the Gulf impacts how migrants actually start thinking about their health and what they think of, and how they then engage with health once they're in the GCC. Before getting anywhere close to having a visa or job contract to get to one of the GCC states, as soon as migrants approach perhaps a labor recruiter, or perhaps if they are approached for a job contract, one of the first hurdles they have is to actually pass this medical test. The medical tests, this is one of the areas where the GCC actually seems to cooperate quite well. There is a Gulf Health Council. They control, Houtan will correct me if I'm wrong on any of these things, but they actually are the ones that determine what these health screenings should look like. I believe the most recent update to this was just last year. It is quite a laborious and rigorous sets of measures that have to be passed and cleared by prospective migrants. And included in that, of course, are infectious disease tests. And for migrants who have just been at the very early stages of starting this process of going through lots of authentication and documentation, the first fear that they have is that they will fail this test. And whether or not it's verified or true, prospective migrants get so much of their information through their network of friends, of family, people who've come back. And a lot of people also sort of inspire this concern and anxiety in them, which is that you have to pass this. There's not a part of being in that process where migrants actually think that this is about them gaining early insight into a problem they might have, a medical problem they might have, that it's about preventing them getting sick, it's about getting an appropriate diagnosis and treatment. That's not how going through the medical screening is understood by most migrants. For them, it is understood as a requirement of an immigration regime. And that only healthy migrants who meet these very high standards will have access to jobs here. Migrants who actually manage to get through the tests, manage to pass it, and then get to the stage of getting a visa and arriving in the Gulf, many of them continue to be medically screened here, depending on their category of employment, some more rigorously than others. Those who work, for example, in food preparation industries or who work in sectors where they're in regular proximity with others would be tested very regularly, again, for a host of existing infectious diseases. Those who work on construction sites and are also at risk because they live perhaps in close confines with many of their colleagues and their peers would also be regularly tested. These experiences reinforce the same levels of anxiety amongst many of the migrants that I've spoken to, the returned migrants I spoke to in Pakistan, because just as they assumed that they got their jobs because they were in good health, they very much assume that they can only stay in these jobs as long as they remain in good health. And that means there are there's a certain impact on how they think of and conceive of health authorities and sort of the medical field or medical system in general when they're here. I think it leads them to engage, excuse me, in certain behaviors which could be challenging in a circumstance that we're in right now, where you actually want to have migrants very integrated into the campaigns you're having to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. Migrants fear showing any symptoms or signs of an illness. Many of them may try to hide being ill. And this is because of the fact that even if it's not true and it's not going to happen, they worry that it will lead to a loss of job, a loss of wages, and eventually deportation. So, I mean, I'm not going into a discussion here talking about the rationality or the public health logics in which these medical screening systems are geared. That's a separate conversation. This is more about what I see as the consequences of the early encounters that prospective migrants experience with health officials and healthdom before they actually even get here. I think following on from this pandemic, we're going to obviously see changes again to screening systems for migrants all over the world. And that is where I think I have some concerns. I'm going to stop. I think I've gone too long.
Thank you very much, Zahra. You've presented some very interesting questions about this medical inspection regime and how it impacts migrant workers and how they think about their health and their jobs. So thank you very much. We will come back to you for sure in the discussion. Houtan, let's turn to you now. Why is it that migrant workers around the world live in such cramped and crowded places? I mean, presumably in some of these countries, including in the Gulf, space is not really much of an issue. And given how quickly the virus has spread among this vulnerable part of the population, is this pandemic the wake-up call that Gulf countries need to change the conditions under which migrant workers live and work?
Thanks very much, Noah, and thanks to Brookings for the invitation. Very happy to be part of the exchange today. It's a very good question, and I think it's a question that many governments are posing this question to themselves currently. Because I know, for example, here in Qatar, the government sees this as an opportunity to make fundamental changes to some of these accommodation situations. There is very clear legislation in Qatar, and as in many countries, that what are the minimum requirements for worker accommodations? Okay, 6 square meters per individual, bed, a private closet, but are they always being respected across the board? No, we have different types of businesses. We have good companies, we have bad companies. We have companies that try to really lower their costs. We also have certain situations where workers are actually given an allowance for accommodation. And these workers try to save as much money, of course, because they've left their families behind, they've come to a new country to work as long as they can, save as much money to send back to their families and help their families. So they may also try to save money and really go into cramped shared accommodations with their friends, with new friends that they make here or in other countries to save money. So it's not as black and white that it's just companies, for example, providing good or bad accommodations. It's also an awareness raising amongst the worker communities that needs to take place to say, listen, you may save money, but you may not be able to work for a long time, and you may not be able to earn for a long time if you go into cramped accommodations because of situations such as COVID-19. But here, as I was saying earlier, it's seen as an opportunity to really try to give more space to workers, change accommodation, make sure that illegal accommodations are closed. You may have seen in the local press here how the number of inspection of accommodations has increased. The government just published a series of numbers 4 days ago on how many fines that had been issued, where they found accommodations were not respected. There had been accommodation rules were not respected. They have been given a week to clean up. Labor inspectors will be going back regularly. So really, this is a great opportunity to make sure that accommodations are respecting legislation, and also go further above and beyond just respecting current legislation to see are current legislation sufficiently protecting workers. And I must say, last but not least, how important it is to ensure proper consultation with the workers themselves, because they're the ones that know their situation better than anyone else. I can speak on behalf of the ILO. You know, Zahra can tell you about her research. We can have also Borzou talk about his discussions with the workers. You can talk about your research, Noah. But the workers themselves live it on a daily basis, on a nightly basis, and they need to be part of the solution. They need to be given a voice, and they need to be given the platform to contribute to changes that will be taking place right now. And really, it is a times of crisis, but let's look at it as a time of opportunity to address some of the long-lasting issues that have not been addressed so far. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Houtan, for that. Consultation with workers themselves. It sounds like a sort of very logical, basic, but of course fundamental approach that unfortunately I suppose has not really been happening enough. Borzou, given this thirst for information, right, on not just the plight of migrant workers, but sort of just how this virus is unfolding and affecting various sections of across the society, and with lockdowns in place and severe restrictions on travel, how do journalists access credible information about the plight of these migrant workers during this pandemic?
Thank you so much, Noha, and everyone else for organizing this. There are many ways to report at this story, the story of the migrants. I'll, start off with a kind of a story about a project that I did many years ago, maybe 14 years ago, in which I traced the lives of migrant workers from southern India, Kerala, to the Gulf, the UAE, and so on, and spoke with them, spoke with their spouses, spoke with the workers themselves, and was given by my newspaper at the time the sort of luxury of traveling to both Kerala and then to the UAE. That's something that a lot of news outlets won't give you anymore for a story like this because of budget constraints and so on. And the challenges of reporting a story like that are pretty immense. You're talking about multiple languages, multiple dialects within those languages, kind of getting at a kind of community that is not used to speaking to the press. These migrant laborers, domestic laborers, and so on, people who are not savvy about the media. These are people who don't have spokespeople. And they don't necessarily understand what good it will do them to speak to the press. And so you have to explain a lot to them. Many of them are from very simple, humble backgrounds. Many are literate, but some are not. And they tend to come from, I think this is super important to note, the migrant laborers tend to come from marginalized communities within their own communities. So they're, kind of in a way, doubly, triply kind of stigmatized. They're not people living in the nice sections of Manila or Kerala province and so on, who are deciding that they're going to go and spend some time in the Gulf and earn some money and come back. They're often from very disadvantaged backgrounds from where they're coming from, and so they're victimized, and they think of themselves as they're often scared, cornered in the first place, just in terms of the posture of their communities and sub-communities and so on. And that makes it very difficult to get them to speak. There are associations in the Gulf, in India, in the Asian countries that are speaking out on behalf of those groups, of these individuals. They're not exactly trade organizations, they're more like human rights organizations. But for example, in Turkey, among migrant laborers and domestic workers, there's an association led by a Turkmenistani woman from Turkmenistan, who is sort of speaking out on behalf of the laborers and so on. And she has support from other human rights and labor rights organizations and so on. And so that's kind of an interface, and then you go to that person, that organization, and you ask them, can you put me in touch with the women themselves, or the laborers themselves, or the migrants themselves? And often they are, they don't want to talk, because, we're talking about, in many cases in the Gulf, societies that do not necessarily value their freedom of the press, governments that restrict or punish people who speak out about conditions, even if they're full-fledged citizens. So, imagine the fear of those people who are marginalized in their own communities back in Asia or the Philippines, or wherever they're coming from, sub-Saharan Africa increasingly. Perhaps part of communities that are even violently oppressed in those parts of the world, coming on a promise of earning some cash through a shady agency to a Gulf country that itself is also very oppressive and very hostile towards media rights. So getting at those communities often requires asking or offering, anonymity if they want to speak. You don't have to use your real name. Getting into and experiencing, witnessing their living conditions or even their working conditions is often extremely difficult. And Houtan mentioned the opportunity of going to labor camps and residences and dormitories and so on, and sort of scrutinizing those. What I have found is that governments give you access when they think that they have something to show off. So it's very rarely a kind of a random visit to a dormitory. If they have like a Potemkin village style place where the workers are very well treated, they might take you there. But it's very seldom that you get a chance to go unescorted or unmediated into one of these environments. And so it's a struggle, but I think it's really worth it. We in the media community, among journalists, we value these stories and value the experiences of these people, of these migrant laborers. They often have amazing stories and really compelling trajectories to their lives, very surprising, you get to talk to them, and ask them why you're doing this, and it's often a story that really breaks your heart and really pierces through the noise. I'm doing this because we're in the Sudanese area where I live. Basically, we were slaughtered and we had to find a way out of Sudan. I'm doing this to put my little sister through medical school because she's the only one of our family that is going to university, and this is the only chance that I have. And where you do pierce through the barriers and get at the stories of these individuals, it's quite often very powerful. And you find that these people are much savvier, despite having a lack of education, about the ways of the world than some hedge fund manager, have experienced universes that we will never know, and so very valuable and very compelling narratives in the lives of these people. And I'll leave it with that.
All right, thank you very much, Borzou, for that. Zahra, let me come back to you. In a paper that you published a couple of days ago, you mentioned that public health officials must address this issue of hostility directed at migrant workers, especially during this pandemic. Is there an example of where this has been done effectively? How would addressing this hostility approach look like?
Yeah, I mean, I brought that up, and I bring that up now, not so much because we've heard blatant examples of any of it happening right now in the GCC, but it is experience that has grown through past global occasions where we've had other outbreaks of disease, and some of the interest has been centered on migrant communities who are seen to have been carrying these diseases. So in 2009, I think in parts of the US, when there were outbreaks of one of the viruses, there were concentrated outbreaks around some Mexican seasonal and temporary migrant workers in the agricultural field. And so that actually led to a lot of discussion amongst policymakers sort of to prepare for the next time, that you need to be aware that how you message around the spread of a disease and an infectious disease like this, because if you message it badly, you can end up having a community response which starts targeting and stigmatizing certain bits of the population. And in the context of this region of the GCC, normally I'm the first person who's going to put my hand up and say, give me data, because you want to know what's happening at a sort of critical, disaggregated kind of level. You want to know how is this, who's being affected, and where are the cases spreading. And this information is critical for research, for analysis, for a lot of things. But in this current moment of this, when we're right in the midst of it, when we're actually dealing with the challenge of how to both contain the disease and also protect the health rights of people who are being affected by it, I find myself strangely ambivalent and reluctant to get a lot of public access to data, particularly because people's curiosity is usually along the lines of nationality basis, like show me nationality-based data. We all know what the nationality components of Qatar informally are anyway. Anybody who looks at the demography of the place, even in the absence of nationality-based disaggregated data, we know what the numbers look like. So one can only assume that the cases of COVID that are positive in Qatar will probably follow patterns of that. And while a lot of people who care deeply about migrants' welfare and health would like to know this, so that people, if there are extra pockets of concern that attention should be focused on, community attention, public health attention, that is really important. But at the same time, it can also spark the opposite kinds of conversations, which is that this disease then starts getting associated with migrants of certain nationalities and origins. And that in itself becomes a form of stigmatization. These medical tests that I was talking about, for whatever logics and rationales they come out of, and those will no doubt continue, they carry with them certain degrees of the same nationality-based stigmatization and biases. There are also class biases embedded. Not all of us who come to the Gulf have the same kind of testing done, right? So in the current circumstance, we need information, we need good communication, we need that, and we need to know that all communities are receiving focused care and attention, and we also need to know about the problems. But I think we do need, in this current moment, I'm concerned about information coming out which leads to these kinds of stigmas and biases that have occurred elsewhere. And yeah, so I guess that's my response.
Thank you for that, Zahra. Houtan, let me come back to you. Several hotlines have been set up whereby workers can file, can either ask a question or voice a concern or file a complaint about violations, accommodation violations, employment violations, etc. And so these hotlines are all well and good, but how do we know that they are enforced?
Thanks, Noah. I think when it comes to transparency and seeing if these hotlines or these initiatives launched by the government is working, it's very important to take a look at the statistics that have also been published. The government published also numbers on the number of complaints, questions they've received, when it comes to complaints, how many they've managed to resolve. So we're seeing more and more, the government also realized that it's important to be transparent about how effective the system is, not only for the general public, but also to gain the trust of the workers themselves, which is a big challenge that all governments face, especially in times of crisis. Workers are afraid. If they come forward, even if they have symptoms, what will happen to them? Will they be jailed? Will they be deported? Will they lose their job? Will they be fired? So that's why I think this transparency during times of crisis is fundamentally important, not only for everyone to know if the systems are effective and efficient, but because also to make them efficient and gain the trust of workers. So from what we hear from our contact with the worker communities, with different community leaders, with the different international trade unions who are active here, we're receiving positive feedback on specifically these different numbers and hotlines that have been set up by the government. But again, many workers are hesitant in reaching out. That also comes out very clearly in what we're finding out.
Okay, thank you, Houtan. Borzou, international news organizations are very focused on covering COVID-19 at home, right? And as an international correspondent, do you think that there's been a decline in the appetite for stories about the Gulf region and the Middle East more broadly? And if that happens, what are the risks?
I think that it depends on the news outlets. You know, we at the Independent seem to still have an appetite for international news on COVID-19. Many other issues have fallen by the wayside. That probably would be getting a lot more attention if it wasn't for COVID-19, such as, for example, like what's happening in Libya. But, you know, the COVID-19 angle internationally, if you look at the New York Times, if you look at the New York Times has a whole blog devoted to what's happening on COVID-19 globally, because here's a pandemic which is global and affecting everyone, and everyone is trying different solutions and so on. I think the Gulf, because it's so opaque, and you know the policy making instruments are not so transparent and so on, there's just less news because less people are allowed to actually report. But even if you look a little bit north to Iran, there's been a lot of stories there, just because there's been a lot of controversy about what's happening there, and there's been a lot of, and within the factions of Iran, in those cracks, there's been a lot of noise back and forth, a lot of internal criticism and so on, and so that has generated a lot of heat. Where there's heat, there's journalism, as people know. And if you look just in general, if there is, you know, my editors, for example, on this story that we just did today about domestic laborers, undocumented often, in the Gulf region and the Middle East and so on, they were super excited about that. They thought that was super interesting. If you look at the attention that was paid to the narrative of coronavirus sneaking back into Singapore through these migrant camps, and what a compelling narrative that was. You can no longer ignore these people because because of this pandemic. You can no longer ignore the condition of these people. I think that there is still a lot of interest, at least on the part of editors. I don't know the page view numbers and so on. But I can tell you, for example, a colleague of mine did a story about coronavirus in Sweden, and if you look at the comments underneath there, the incredible amount of comments, there's still a lot of interest globally about what's happening in other countries with regard to coronavirus, whether it's migrant communities in the Gulf or other parts of Asia, or it's just how various countries are what tools they're using to get out of this mess.
Thanks, Borzou, for that very, very interesting insight. Zahra, I see a whole bunch of questions. One of them from our viewers is about the legality angle and the spread of COVID-19. And in particular, people without proper documentation and the fear involved in that, well, preventing them from going to hospitals, etc., sort of along the lines of what you were saying earlier. And I'd like to link this to, again, something that you argued in your paper a couple of days ago. You say that there is, despite the fact that there are 150 million migrant workers around the world, there is no global commitment among states and international bodies that bind them to certain health outcomes for migrants. And so how would this global commitment look like? Why, why aren't existing international legal sort of mechanisms and conventions sufficient? Why haven't they been helped?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a perennial thing. You have the WHO and various other international bodies advocating for a far more comprehensive global approach to managing and supporting migrants' healthcare. One that would commit sending states and receiving states, as well as various bodies along the way, from recruiters, private bodies as well, to guarantee that migrants' health is maintained at the various stages of the migratory process, because it's understood that there are different needs at the pre-departure stage, which includes things like going through the medical screening and all. Also making sure that their health rights are ensured once they are in a host country, and then again upon return and reintegration. Right now, it remains very piecemeal, and there has not been the global will to have this some sort of transnational framework in place, and that maybe, I mean, if I'm going to be optimistic, as Houtan was suggesting we should try to be, the optimism might be that this current pandemic, which is hitting people all over the world, and communities all over, migrant communities and citizen communities, might actually propel something in this direction, which would ensure that there's more cooperation. Despite potential downturns to the global economy, the fact is more and more countries are increasingly reliant on temporary forms of labor to meet the needs of their local labor markets. We're seeing this even in the case of the United States, where you see some of the exceptions that were made on migration controls recently. So if you are going to still be reliant on temporary forms of labor, then you need to be much more serious about how you're going to ensure that their health rights, not just the fact that they're not bringing infectious diseases, but that their health rights are maintained. For example, in the case of the GCC corridor between South Asia, most of the control in terms of information around the information that's extracted, the data that's taken for potential migrants, is all on the principle of out of the interests of the GCC states. The sending states are only really helping to process a lot of the paperwork. All the approvals are done through the GCC states. And it's a bit of a one-way sort of process. And there needs to be, this definitely needs to be changed. It is very early days to say, and unfortunately sometimes reactive policies leave lingering impacts which do not improve. They can actually make things much worse. I hope that this is an occasion where that doesn't happen, and we see a better coordinated attempt to manage the health of migrants at a global level.
Thank you, Zahra. Houtan, there are a couple of questions. Two related questions for you. In terms of the role of consultations with workers, what is the status of the joint committees that are supposed to serve as a platform for migrant workers to voice their concerns? That's one question. And the other sort of closely related question is, how do you see these consultations with workers working concretely? How would that look like?
Thanks, Noha, and thanks for the questions, whoever's posed them. Fundamentally important question, very dear to our heart at the ILO, as you can imagine. Joint committees, I'm very happy to report that the important work on joint committees is advancing well. For those who are not familiar with the concept of joint committees and are watching this program, let me very quickly tell you what are joint committees. There are democratic elections at the enterprise level. Workers vote in order to elect their representative, and then those representatives sit with management representatives and discuss issues of concern, such as accommodation, food, wages, everything. So those are joint committees. There is legislation here that encourages the creation of joint committees in Qatar, and we have partnered with the government as well as the private sector in order to help set up these joint committees. Something else that here we have done with the government is create more of a national platform where these joint committees come together exchange lessons learned, discuss their challenges, successes, but also their failures. So really a platform to exchange ideas in order to save joint committees from repeating the same mistakes that other joint committees may have made in the past. Currently, we are just in the last stages of working with the Ministry of Labor in putting out a publication on the effectiveness of joint committees in times of crisis as a result of COVID-19. So we hope that will be published very soon in the next 7 to 10 days. That really puts joint committees at the forefront in the fight against COVID-19. Why? Again, because the workers know their situation better than anyone else, and that's why they need to be consulted and they need to be part of the solution. So that's the work that has been going on. We just had a webinar with some of these worker elected representatives about a week ago, as well as the management representatives. Really fascinating discussions. They also submitted a series of questions where not only workers representatives, but also management representatives wanted the government to clarify some of the guidelines and policies that they have introduced since the outbreak of COVID-19. We're working with the ministry providing those answers, and those will be made also public very soon. So that's when it comes to joint committees. What was your second question, Noah?
Sorry, the second question from our audience was about these consultations with workers and how that would look like concretely.
Yes, thank you. Yes, so it's very important. So what we do, you may be aware that here every 6 months, there is a semi-annual meeting between our office, the Ministry of Labor, as well as international trade unions from different sectors. So we just had a brief session of that about 2 weeks ago, where we listened to trade unions express their concerns, share with us what they believe the government here and the ILO office should be doing, and how they would like to also support some of these initiatives that are happening. So that's one avenue where here we're trying to make sure that the trade union voice is fed back to the government, to us, on everything that we do in response to COVID-19. Apart from that, also through the community leaders, through the contacts that we have with the community of migrant workers, with the workers themselves, we always try to get feedback from them. Also, joint committees is another one. We have community liaison officers that work with us and the ministry here and international trade unions. So really various avenues. Having said that, I think also the role of NGOs are fundamentally important. We're in regular contact with a series of NGOs, including Amnesty International, for example, Human Rights Watch, all the different, migrant rights, to really also get those feedbacks, to see what is the positive, but also negative things that they're hearing from their networks down on the ground, in order to ensure that whatever we do responds to their needs in the context of COVID-19.
Okay, thank you very much, Houtan. Borzou, you're based in Turkey. Do you see any parallels between the way in which the Turkish government is addressing the issue of migrant workers and refugees, the issue of refugees as well, and other groups living in close quarters, and the way in which Gulf countries are addressing these issues?
Well, I think it's important to note that Turkey nominally is a republic. And what that means is that there is a sort of semi-regular immigration status that people can obtain when they come here. You don't have the kafala system. If you show you have a certain amount of money in a bank account, basically, and not even that much, you can get a residency. And it used to be quite a bit easier before the Syrian refugee crisis and so on. There is, in theory, a path to citizenship, even in Turkey, for people who are living here. It's not rooted in blood or family necessarily. It's a tough one. There's all sorts of caveats and so on. But so it's a little bit different in that sense. There is an attempt to maintain some semblance of order within the camps, the refugee infrastructure throughout the country. I think that by and large, Turkey gives quite a bit of free rein to NGOs and international organizations that operate in those camps. not 100%, but quite a bit. And there is I would say, a kind of rather vibrant civil society kind of infrastructure here that is addressing those needs. Let me give you an example. You recently had this big crisis up in Edirne near the Turkish-Greek border, where based on the invitation of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, a lot of Syrian refugees, got on the road, and Afghan and Iranian refugees as well, living here, migrants, went to the border to try to cross into the EU. That didn't work out so well. And then right as that was unfolding, you had the coronavirus pandemic kind of explode throughout the planet. And so you had this sort of dual thing happening where you had this very vulnerable community, already very vulnerable, in this horrible situation where they're stuck in this border area with no shelter and so on. And then, to add to that misery, lockdown orders throughout the world for NGOs and, major UN organizations, UNHCR, et cetera. People were at that point were very scared. They weren't exactly sure just how contagious this virus was. And people were, rather frightened. And there was basically orders to the UN, I got confirmed, don't leave the compounds for now. Let's, stay in and see how this develops. And what happened was that, some volunteers and other NGOs started approaching the UN and saying, hey, we'll do this and this and this and this and this for these guys if you give us some money for some resources and so on. And so you had sort of volunteers and de facto organizations working with UN, and Turkey permitted that. They didn't crack down on that in a way I would imagine in some Gulf countries they would look askance at the UN collaborating with NGOs and private citizens to deliver relief and so on. So I think the freewheeling nature of that was probably unusual compared to the Gulf. But it sort of shows the way things can work in a crisis situation like that.
Thanks, Borzou. I have a question for the three of you. I'll start with Zahra. What is your view of how the media has been covering this issue of migrant workers in the Gulf and COVID-19? And this also sort of touches on a couple of the questions that we've been getting from our viewers. What are your thoughts on the media coverage of this issue?
I think my thoughts vary on what I'm reading. Obviously, it's really good to see some strong journalism that's taking place, that's drawing attention to really important issues. I found it interesting, particularly trying to complicate some of the transnational dimension of this crisis, where you've had some of the GCC states actually requesting countries of origin to make arrangements to repatriate groups of migrants. And I found media coverage of that very interesting, because it actually showed how you have migrants who are in a situation where they're somewhat trapped because their countries of origin are also like in India and Pakistan during their lockdowns, they did not necessarily want to receive new cohorts of migrants with their own citizens returning. So some of that coverage, which is looking in deeply into stories I think are very important. I think it is really good that in the middle of this, in the middle of the global sort of period of self-interest where we're probably all most concerned immediately about ourselves, it's extremely valuable and important to have journalists still continuing to maintain a close watch on the conditions of vulnerable communities of migrants. Having said that, what's also been really interesting to me is to note that even in the middle of this situation, geopolitics have not completely died out, because I have certainly seen some regional outlets which written of great concern of the appalling conditions around migrants in Qatar, and have highlighted the valiant efforts to take care of migrants in the middle of the crisis in other GCC countries. And to me, there's definitely a distinct political and geopolitical tenor to that. So I think It's, dispassionate, objective, important journalism is great, but one has to also be aware of the fact that there can be strange spins on the story.
Thank you, Zahra. Houtan?
Yeah, no, thanks very much. This is a very important question. And for the record, journalists and the press are a dear partner of the International Labour Organization and the UN in general. They communicate to the wider audience, they raise fundamentally important questions during critical times. So really, we need them. They definitely need to be part of the solution, as they always are needed to be part of the solution, especially now during COVID-19, where we have a crisis situation that is global. For the very first time in a long time, it's global. Every country, every community is affected to different degrees. News is rapidly evolving. The situation is rapidly evolving. So it's very difficult to stay on top of it, I figure. And really, from having seen the coverage, just like our world, I see that reporting is also becoming very polarized. Here, I'm going to be a bit controversial, I think, and I speak as Houtan now, not as an ILO official. I can tell you from my own experience in the past week, and I've done about, I would say, 8 interviews in the past week with international press. Once I've been misquoted to a point that it could be very counterproductive to our work here and what we're trying to do for migrant workers. So obviously the journalist did not have that in mind. Second, my interview was not included because it was not convenient to the point that the journalist was trying to make. And these two are international newspapers. So I think because of the situation, we need to be very, very careful and really report on the situation as it is presented. We need to dig. You need to ask the tough questions. You need to push us. You really do. But at the same time, let's not forget that you need to present all sides of the story, not just one side.
Houtan, if I could just jump in there. When you say your interview wasn't included because it was not convenient for that story, could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. So, I think for all of you, it's the same. As soon as you start an interview with a journalist, you see where they're going. You see if they've already made up their mind or they're there truly listening and making up their mind as the story unfolds. This journalist had already made up his mind. And at the end of the interview, and it was a 35 minutes interview, he said, okay, thank you for your time. I don't agree with your points. I said, it's okay. I mean, that's the whole point of dialogue. The next morning, the article comes out, and this is an international journal, not a single quote from me, because the whole point that he was making was basically contradictory to what I was saying. So basically, my quote was excluded because it would have shown another side of the coin, if you want.
Thank you, Houtan. Borzou, what are your reactions to these?
I mean, there's always bad journalism, and it's not so hard to, if you're at the UK Independent or the Guardian or the New York Times or the Washington Post, these sorts of highfalutin news organizations, it's not so hard to make the case to your editors that yes, this is the angle we're going to take, but we should include, this on the other hand. It's very easy. Your editors will love you for that. So I think that's just a weak journalist. It makes a story better to have on the other hand, there are some people who disagree completely with this thesis. And here's what they say, and have a couple of paragraphs devoted to that. So it's not such a tough challenge. I would say that, where people and journalists try to get in the weeds of, too much in the weeds of policy and policymakers and politics, we lose readers, we lose our fun, and we, get caught in a trap. Where journalists try to focus on the fundamentals of reporting and get at the people whose lives are affected, I think readers appreciate that more. I think that, and we enjoy that more. It's been tough for journalists because, we're the people who love to go out And, it's been, I don't know, 5, 6 weeks where I'm sort of stuck. I can't go anywhere. Would I love to go to the Gulf and and visit it wouldn't even be physically possible. There's no flights out of Istanbul there haven't been flights out of Istanbul to the Gulf in weeks now. So, it's tough, and a lot of stuff has to be done by phone at this point. But I think it's still, and I think that I have a little bit of advantage, having been stuck in Baghdad during those very, very hard years when we were confined to our compound. I'm used to drawing out compelling stories with people just in phone conversations. Draw me a picture. Just describe to me what you see outside your window right now. Okay, thank you. Yeah, could you give me a little bit more description and so on. So I think that I have that kind of training for this era where we're sort of stuck here. But I think a lot of the journalists are just stuck in their apartments right now, not even allowed to go to the office anymore. And they don't know what else to do but to call up people and, the usual suspects, officials, NGO people, and, try to get exclusive scoops. Whereas the most compelling stories are, how did we get this amazing interview with a nanny stuck in her house as a virtual prisoner in Istanbul, with these crazy clients who are demanding that she wash their sheets every day. I just asked my nanny, do you know anyone who has any horror stories? And, that turned out to be the lead of our story.
Okay, thank you very much, Borzou. We have just a few more minutes left. Houtan, let me come back to you, and Zahra, it would be great if you could also weigh in on a number of these questions. Firstly, with regards to the lockdown on the industrial area in Qatar, there are a number of questions. What is the strategy there? How is Qatar managing the issue of the lockdown in the industrial area? What do we know? What are the big questions that we don't know the answers to yet? But also the impact of the pandemic on remittances. Do you see receiving countries? Is there good coordination with the receiving countries on this issue? And of course, also the issue of repatriation and some of the pressures on the home states or the sending states to repatriate their citizens. And finally, Zahra, there was also a question about the plight of domestic workers throughout all of this, and sort of because they fall under a different sort of jurisdiction. So if you can very quickly answer those big questions, that would be great.
Thank you very much for those fundamentally important questions. I'll try to do justice very quickly to them. On the lockdown, this is a question for the government. You need to ask them, but we've been exchanging information on this, and of course, raising some questions and concerns. What we have been told is that, as you've seen now, they have a strategy into slowly removing the lockdown. Now they have removed the lockdown from 3 streets. What they're doing is they have put in a protocol. They take all the workers from those 3 streets, they test them, they isolate them while they get the test results. If they test positive, then they take them to the hospital and treated. If not, they can go back to their accommodations. Meanwhile, they're isolated. They do a complete deep cleaning and disinfection of the 3 streets, so that when the workers go back, then there's no risk of them being contaminated, if you want. This is a time-consuming process. It's a costly process, but we're very happy to see that the government is taking this seriously and doing it. And the treatment for workers is at no cost, including the testing. And they're not considering the status or the legal status of the workers either. Meaning, if you're in the country illegally, right now it's times of crisis, that's not important for us, for the government here. They're testing them for free, treating them for free. When it comes to remittances, I think this is going to be disastrous. I think this is really something that keeps us up all at night, that we work in this field. Not only there are technological challenges right now for some of the workers to be able to send money back, while these money marts or different organizations that send your money, the legal ones, are shut down, either in the countries of origin, also in the countries of destination where the workers are. But here, for example, the government has been conscious of that. You may have seen that they just said the employers of domestic workers should open up bank accounts for domestic workers, some of the most vulnerable workers. We just received a question on domestic workers that Zahra is going to answer. So there are initiatives or steps being taken to ensure that those funds can be transferred. Now, that's the situation now. Will these jobs last? If not, I don't think if the private sector is not helped, I don't think jobs will last, and it will be disastrous for everyone.
I'll briefly touch on the repatriation challenges and then the domestic workers one. So in terms of efforts to repatriate, the Gulf states have not unilaterally tried to get the countries to all have their citizens return home. That hasn't been something that was a public call, nor was it a call that sending countries sent out, as we saw in other parts of the world where citizens were told to come back. The logistics of this have to also be considered. I mean, there are about 8 million Indians who work across the 6 GCC states. Repatriating 8 million people doesn't happen that easily or quickly. Receiving states have been asked, in some cases, some workers who have lost their jobs, either right before the epidemic or as a result of some of the COVID restrictions and closures of businesses. And most of the receiving states in South Asia have certainly taken back some of their citizens, and but they have also asked for additional time just so that they can expand their testing and quarantine facilities to receive their workers from the Gulf. The domestic workers issue is critically important, and I've been thinking a lot about it. And I think on two separate points in relation to COVID. One is that, of course, domestic workers, in some ways you'd assume, well, perhaps they're protected because they work within a home and they don't have a lot of daily contact. But the fact is they'd work in a very intimate, close, upfront and personal space with their employers and their employers' families. So if someone in a house is ill, most likely the domestic worker is then going to certainly be exposed to it as well. And I do believe anecdotally, there are a number of cases in Qatar right now in quarantine where domestic workers are housed as a result of having caught it with their employers. But the second broader thing is really the issue of what the lockdown and the current policies of sheltering in place and staying at home have on domestic workers. It's just 2.5 years ago that we were so delighted to finally have the domestic workers law come into place, which finally assures that these women have a right to go out once a week and have some freedom of mobility. All of that now has come to a grinding halt. And it does make one concerned that this could again start sort of bearing away some of the rights that they had acquired quite recently.
Thank you, Zahra. Borzou, any sort of closing remarks you'd like to make? 30 seconds.
I mean, I don't have any more to add. I would just say that, these are, extremely important issues. And I think that if anything, and this has been said in this conference, this whole pandemic shows that you cannot marginalize these people. You cannot ignore them. We need them, not just, for economically viable kind of economies and so on, but also we need them to be healthy because their health affects our health. And I don't mean to be that, sort of self-centered about it, but it's true. And, you can't just write these people off. You can't write off the migrants and the domestics because we're all part of an integrated whole.
Wonderful. Well, on that note, please thank you very much for this fascinating discussion. It was really great to have sort of the three angles, your work with the ILO, Houtan, the media angle, and a hearing from you, Zahra, and your findings from your fascinating field work. And thank you also to the audience for your questions, and I'm sorry that I was unable to get to all of them. And with that, I'll leave you. Thank you once again.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.